So as a leadership coach in the automotive industry, I'm convinced that the most important thing that dealers can do is focus on retention. Ultimately, dealers are trying to do this. Nobody has an argument with me about the idea that dollars over time, they want to achieve growth. The challenge is, where does that growth come from? And ultimately, it really comes from three critical sources. I call them sources, but from three elements, from three different areas, if you will. Number one, it comes from our advertising and fresh ups. And all you have to do is spend money to get some of that. Spend money in the right places. People will show up and look at our product. But you can see that I've drawn a flat line above that. If our growth truly came from our advertising, then what we would do is we would keep investing more and more and more money into advertising. But the reality is, there comes a point when we can't afford to spend more money on advertising for two reasons. One, it takes away the profitability of our vehicles. And number two, there's a diminishing return on a dollar spent only brings in a lesser and lesser amount of business the more we spend. So the reality is, there comes a point when that flattens out and we don't get additional growth from advertising. Sure, in the beginning, when we first start our business, during this period of time, we need to advertise and we see tremendous growth, just getting the word out that we exist and to let people know where we are and what we offer in the way of products and services. But there comes a point when that no longer provides us with growth. Then what we've got to do, and I call this the A, we need to focus on two critical other areas, the B and the C of growth. And if we don't break it down this way, we could think, oh, we just keep spending money on advertising and we're going to get growth. But when we recognize that that flattens out and that we need to focus on these other areas, it will allow us to put our efforts and our actions in the right places. So the question is, what are B and C? Now, when I speak to groups, typically, I'll ask them, and they come up with it pretty quick. And what they'll admit is that this comes down to repeat business, and this is referrals. Now, I'll admit right here, when you're in front of a whiteboard, you're doing whiteboarding, sometimes spelling doesn't matter. I'll get to words like referrals. Is that 1 R, 2 R's? Don't get caught up in the spelling if I make some mistakes on spelling. Capture the concepts. Anyway, so when you recognize that we need a base of business, but when we got the base of business, our growth is going to come from repeats and referrals, not from this base of business, and not from this part of the business and advertising. So then the question comes down to, how do I build repeats and referrals? And as I said before, I am convinced that retention, which is repeat business, is the most critical element that we can focus our efforts on. So now let's talk about, where does that come from? In order to explain where that comes from, I need to get into a little bit of neuroscience and explain how the brain works, what makes people to behave the way they behave. Because a person choosing to come back to our store is a direct result of how they feel and how they behave. So let's talk about the brain. A simplistic overview of the brain reveals that there are two key areas of the brain. One, which is the rational brain, also called the neocortex. Now, I simply tell you what that is because if you want to fact check me, that's fine. You can do all the research on your own to see what I'm telling you is the truth. The rational brain, or the neocortex. The other part of our brain is the emotional brain, which is called the limbic. Now, why does this all matter? Well, when you think of rational, it's all about logical thought, while emotions is all about feelings. Again, you can ask, why should I care about this? Right now, it doesn't make any difference. Until I tell you that what causes people to behave the way they behave is 75% a direct result of how they feel, and only 25% as a result of good ideas, product and quality and price and all of those things that you can measure. They're logical elements. You think that by all the research, this is where the research is. This is how I feel about the things that I've learned. So when we understand this and we start to realize that in the car business, the majority of what we do today is in the realm of rational. And we're all competing for the same space using the wrong focus. Let me explain. When we think of an oil change, I'll ask audiences, what do you believe are the 3 top items that we believe in the car business are the most important to customers? And invariably, the audience will come up very quickly with the answers. They say, number 1, it all comes down to speed. Number 2, it's about price. And number 3, it's about done right. Great answers. The question is, though, speed, price, and done right. Which of those things are rational and which of those are emotional? A little clue: if it is measurable, it's rational. Speed, it's measurable, right? Rational. Price, measurable, rational. Done right, it's either done right or it's not. I either have an oil leak or I don't. Rational. Every dealer competes with other dealers on the elements that only account for 25% of what make people do what they do. So the question is, what are they doing that impacts on people's emotions? So let me explain a little bit more of how we recognize the emotional element and where we can then focus our efforts in order to impact on that. We take the word trust and we break down the word trust. Now, again, when I ask audiences, is trust emotional or rational? People sit there and they think, and I'll get both answers. And eventually I'll tell them that it is both rational and emotional. In fact, there's 2 elements under each side that explain trust from a rational element, from an emotional element. And the very first comes down to competence. And in the car business, we spend a lot of time on product knowledge. Competence. Do we have the ability to do what we say we will do? Number 2, though, comes down to reliability. Not only can we do what we say we will do we actually do it? Do we follow through? Do we follow through on commitments? Now, if you think about this outside of the car industry, you go to a doctor's office, what do they invariably have on their walls? Diplomas. They want to prove to you, and especially for new customers, new patients, that they have the ability to do what they say they can do. And in the car business, every manufacturer tries to fill that trust gap on the reliability side of things with warranties. It's one of the things that makes our F&I offices very profitable, is by filling the gap of reliability or the fear that something's going to happen with my vehicle and that it's not going to perform the way I expected it to perform. On the flip side, though, again, remember, this is the rational piece, which is only 25% of what makes people do what they do. 75% comes down to these 2 elements. Number 1, authenticity. And number 2, care. Think about it. What happens if you have let's say you go and you're looking at a car, and the person knows everything, the salesperson or the service advisor has tremendous product knowledge, and they have huge amount of inventory. There's no issue with them knowing the product and them having availability of product to be able to sell you. And then they start to talk. And they greet you, hi, my name's Bob, and your name is, and you heard that at the last 3 dealerships that you went to, and you're starting to go, these guys are just like everybody else, and I wasn't treated well at the other place, so is this how I'm going to be treated here? And so one of the most important things that we can do is become authentic. Be who we really are. Converse with them like real human beings. The second part comes down to care. And a story I like to tell about this concept of care is that college student who is low on dollars, very tight budget, doesn't have a lot of money, but they need an oil change on their car. And they're afraid going to the dealership because of the reputation we have. And so they come into the service drive and they say to the service advisor, all I want is an oil change. I don't want it, I don't want anything else. And the service advisor, because normally what happens is, of course, we try to upsell them, right? And so if you think about it, they're afraid that we're going to upsell them. And the challenge we have is, think about it for a second. If, when we're looking at this person's car, we do a walk around and we see a nail in their tire, would we say something? Now, if we were to say something, that would be an expression of care. Now, a lot of people say, well, that's a safety item. Yes, I know, but we don't have to say anything. They told us, they just finished telling us they don't want anything else but the oil change. But we feel compelled because of how we feel to say something to them, even though they told us they don't want it, because we care. And so I'm convinced that a better model than upsell is up here. And I believe that if we practice up care, it will open so many doors for dealerships, so many ways that we will actually develop better relationships with customers, which will allow them, or cause them, not just allow them, will cause them, they will feel compelled to come back because they trust us. Everybody's got competence and reliability. There's very few car dealers that fail on this area, but there's very few car dealers that are truly authentic and care about their customer at that level, because the pressure is to sell. We're all trying to increase gross. And instead, I believe, and I've said this to stores and clients before, if you knew that the customer was always going to come back, there was no fear that we would lose them as a customer, would we ever have to really sell them again? Wouldn't you then only need to look after their best interests? Well, that's the expression of care. Looking after somebody's best interests, putting their best interests ahead of our own. And if we know we're going to get all of their business in the future, why do we have to upsell them? And the only reason that we upsell them is because we're trying to get more today and we're afraid they're not going to come back. And so the challenge for car dealers is to focus on the repeat and the referral business. Bring that customer back, get all of their business, focus on being authentic and caring, and deliver on the goods. And we will drive growth beyond your wildest imagination. That's just an intro to the concept of UpCare. In a future session, I'm going to expand on that, and I look forward to you joining me.